All right, so cash flow equals staying power. Let's do some math. So there's a couple of key components of this. A single family rental is a small business. All right, it's got income, it's got expenses. Okay, and after you pay the expenses, you have your net operating income, which is the profit that you make by taking in your income and then paying your expenses. What do you have left over? If you have a mortgage, if you finance this business, then you have to make that payment, and then you've got your cash flow. Okay, a lot of people that we do business with don't even take mortgages, so their net operating income is the same as their cash flow because there's no mortgage. But I'm going to break out each one of these things here. And by the way, I'm going to encourage you to really absorb this formula. In the future, you're going to let the technology do it for you, but when technology does the calculations for you, you really don't get a good feel for the interplay of the numbers. Okay, you won't really understand what you're looking at unless you know how these numbers play into each other. So do it by hand a dozen times before you lean on the technology to do it for you, so that you really absorb the stuff into your brain. So first there's the rent, all right? And there's a little bit of a nuance to this. You've got, let's say we have an example for the purposes of this, of a property with an asking price of $250 grand. That's the value. And it rents for $2,000 a month or 24 grand a year. You have to take out a vacancy rate. You have to assume there's going to be some vacancy. Otherwise, you're not going to be perceived as being responsible enough to the investor. Assuming 100% occupancy all the time is a little bit pie in the sky. So we use a 5% vacancy rate. If you use Renters Warehouse, we're going to keep the property occupied. We're going to push for long-term leases. We're going to retain tenants. But we assume that there'll be probably 1 month every 2 years the property will be vacant on average. That's about a 5% vacancy rate. And so take that out to come up with your effective gross income. Effective gross income, okay? So rent minus vacancy rate, that's your income. Operating expenses, real simple. Property taxes, homeowners association, if they're in one, insurance, property management. Now I have to change this because you guys don't charge that much, but we use an 8% property management fee. Repairs and maintenance, 8%. Okay, we talk a lot to owners about the idea that you should put 8 or 10% aside. In fact, our website assumes 10%. Just put it aside. So when the phone call comes in that the garage door's off the tracks, you get it fixed, a couple of $100. It's not catastrophic. It's not surprising. The money's been set aside. And I've heard that we're talking about maybe this year rolling out a program where we can actually hang on to some of the rent in an account for the owner to make sure that they have a reserve for repairs. But maintenance and repairs, it's not your mortgage payment. All right, and in our example, the taxes plus HOA plus insurance plus property management plus repairs and maintenance equals a nice round $10,000 to make it easy. All right, so that's the cost to run my business. All right, and a rule of thumb, if you wanted to go back in the napkin on something, institutional quality analysis of rental property assumes about a 42% total expense load. That's vacancy and all these other things wrapped into one number. So if I had $20,000 in rent, I could back in the napkin figure out what a yield might be by knocking out 42%, and the remainder is my NOI. So just a little rule of thumb there that came out of our experience with the big Wall Street firms. So then net operating income, very important number. Again, this is your profitability. So if our rent minus vacancy gave us our effective gross income of $22,800, and our operating expenses were $10,000 all in, our NOI is $12,800. So what that basically means is, and net yield is the term that the industry uses. Cap rate is a term that kind of means the same thing, but we want to try to kind of internalize the vernacular of professional SFR. So net yield is the one we'll use. And here's what that basically means conceptually. If I invested my cash with no mortgage, in other words, if I bought the house for cash, what would be my annual return? Okay, so what would my return as expressed as a percentage? So, in our example, I have NOI of 12.8, right? We just showed that. The effective gross rent minus our operating expenses gave us 12.8 left over. If I divide that by the purchase price of $250, I get a 5.1% net yield. So again, if I wrote a check for $250 grand to buy this property, I'd make $12,800 in profit in the first year. That would be a 5.1% return on my investment. net yield. Now, one of the things about net yield or cap rate that sometimes gets confusing is that as the price goes down, the net yield goes up. Okay, and it may seem confusing, but it's not when you consider this. So the same example where I've got a 12.8 property, but I paid $225 for it, right? $250 was the asking price. 12.8 NOI, I pay asking price of $250, I've got 5.1% net yield. But if I pay $225 instead, the NOI is the same. So NOI, the small number, divided by the bigger number, tells me what percentage the smaller number is as compared to the bigger number, which in this case is 5.7. So I pay a lower price, my net yield goes up. Okay? And this is actually very typical. 5 to 6% is typically what a lot of markets that we're all in are going to yield. Now, if you're in the upper Midwest, you may see a higher yield. You're in the Southeast, you're right in this zone here. If you're in Phoenix and Seattle, it's going to be lower than this. All right, but what you'll see in a few minutes is that when you add the appreciation rate on top of the net yield, that's when you get to that 8 to 10% total all-in return on investment. All right, what tends to happen is if the prices appreciate too much, or not too much, if the prices appreciate more, the rents don't always keep up, and so the yield is a little bit less, but the appreciation rate is higher. If the houses don't appreciate as much, the rents do keep up, then you've got a higher yield because the prices are low, but you don't have as much appreciation because the prices have remained kind of low. So when they balance out, like this example here, 5.7, this could be in Charlotte or Dallas or Orlando. And those are places that get, a 3% annual appreciation on average long term. So there you are, 8.7. All right, so now I've got a mortgage payment, also known as debt service. So if I do buy with a mortgage, two things have changed here. One, how much money I keep is lower because I have to pay a mortgage payment out of it. But also how much money I actually chunked in up front is lower because I borrowed money to buy the property. So in this situation, my price of $250, let's imagine I put down 30%. So I have a $75,000 down payment. So my mortgage amount is $175,000. And by the way, 30% down payment, just for philosophical purposes, I would suggest to you that you should express that as the minimum somebody should put down. If they put down too little, they wind up having too tight of a cash flow at the end of their mortgage payment, and you'll see what I mean in a second. I recommend, when people say how much should I put down, I say half. If I had $250,000, I wouldn't buy a house for $250,000. I'd buy 2 houses for $250,000 and borrow $125,000 on each of them, because then I've got fat cash flow, plenty of equity in the property, and I'm doing this for the long term. I'd rather wait a couple of years to buy the next one. Instead of buying 3 houses with my $250,000 or 4 houses, I'll buy 2 and I'll keep saving and buy 2 more in 3 or 4 years. All right, so in this situation, I got a mortgage of $175,000. So if I had a 5% mortgage rate, that would be $934 a month. Times 12 is $11,200. So my debt service, my mortgage payments for the year, are $11,208. So back to the example, I had an effective gross income of $22,800 minus my $10,000 in operating expenses, left me with $12,800 in NOI, but now I got to pay the $11,208 in debt service, which leaves me cash flow of $1,592 for the year. So you can see how in the case of the mortgage here, it gets kind of thin even with a 30% down payment. So, if someone's got to replace an HVAC, they go into the negative that year. All right, so it really is better to put down a lot of money. But here, in terms of coming up with what my percentage is, I don't compare that $1,592 with the $250 I paid for it. I compare it to the $80,000 I invested, plus, $75 plus closing costs. So the small number, $1,592, divided by the big number, $80,000, is a 2% cash-on-cash return. All right, so not stellar, but still positive. All right, so from the top, gross income minus vacancy, effective gross income minus operating expenses, divided by, equals NOI, divided by the purchase price equals the net yield. And then if I got financing, it's the gross income minus vacancy equals effective gross income minus operating expenses equals NOI minus debt service equals cash on cash return divided by the cash invested equals my cash on cash return percentage. Okay? So what I'm going to want you to do is go pick a house, any house that you currently have been leasing or is under management under your account. Go and do the math. Look up on Zillow what it's worth or figure it out for yourself. Figure out what it costs to operate, pull those taxes out, figure a number for insurance, go down the list, figure out what the net yield would be on that house. In fact, if you raised your hand earlier because you have a client who actually wants to sell, use that house. Figure out what it's worth retail right now. You know what the rent is. You can figure out what the taxes are. So go and do this formula. You've got a handout, by the way, in your inbox that has all these slides on there. So you can go do and just do it on a piece of paper with a calculator. All right, figure out what that house would yield if somebody came along and paid cash for it. All right, then go and do that with 5 or 6 or 7 other houses around your area, spread out, different school districts, different price points, and get a feel for what kind of net yields your market area returns.